Good evening, everybody. My name is Madeline Ward, and I'm lead curator for art at Aberdeen Art Gallery and Museums. For over 130 years, we have been collecting art for the city. This publicly owned collection contains art that spans the centuries and circumnavigates the globe. Today, the collection contains almost 40,000 items of fine and decorative art and continues to grow. Aberdeen Art Gallery reopened in 2019 after a major once-in-a-lifetime redevelopment, and we were so proud to have our effort and hard work recognised in 2020 when we were selected as a shared winner of the Art Fund Museum of the Year award. I'm delighted to share a brief selection of some of my personal highlights and related insights from the collection this evening, and would like to thank Bloomberg Philanthropies and Art UK for the opportunity. As we're looking at Aberdeen's collection this evening, it seemed to make perfect sense to start with this image or view of Aberdeen painted by William Mossman. Mossman was probably born in Aberdeen around 1700. He spent around 6 years in Italy, where he would have become familiar with the late Baroque and Rococo styles of the era. In the early 1750s, Mossman settled back in Aberdeen, where in 1756 he received a commission from the council to paint this view. Mossman's view of Aberdeen presents a peaceful, prosperous city. The river and land is busy with workers. Well-dressed townsfolk promenade. The land is ordered, it's well stocked with animals, and ships travel in and out. All suggests wealth and connectivity with the world outside of Scotland. Aberdeen's collection contains many views of the city from various prospects, spanning the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. Some are oil paintings like this, but others are drawings, prints and watercolours. But for me, it's this one that stands out of the crowd for a number of reasons. The first is its size. What you don't get from looking at Mossman's painting on a computer screen is any sense of its true size. Its scale is pretty epic. At over 2 meters wide by 1.2 meters in height, this work makes for incredibly impressive viewing. But the painting also stands out to me because of 2 brief observations that have been made of it. Now, these observations may be brief, but I think they provide a useful way of getting to know Mossman's painting. The first observation is that the painting is villainously bad. Not a good selling point, I know, but intriguing nonetheless. And the second is that it represents a painter's idyll of Aberdeen. So, not one to shy away from things, let's start off with exploring what is meant by villainously bad. Now, this is a reference to Mossman's apparent mishandling of perspective. Certainly, if you're looking closely, the figures dotted along the River Dee, the river for which Aberdeen is named, dwarf the buildings and the boats nearby. So everything is not quite as it seems. So certainly also look at the landscape in the foreground. It's strangely flattened, again disconcerting. Nothing looks quite as it would in the real world. And at first glance, this isn't the work of an artist of experience, someone who spent 6 years training in Italy. If we think about this a little further, and we compare Mossman's 1756 view of Aberdeen with an earlier view of Aberdeen, again by Mossman, you could fairly be excused for thinking you were looking at a painting by a different hand. So in the earlier work, Mossman has a control of the perspective, but in the 1756 painting, it is quite fairly, it's fair to say it is villainously bad. So what's the explanation for this seeming, this huge change? Now, the likely explanation lies in the backstory, the build-up to the painting taking place. In 1755, the town council had commissioned another artist, John Creswell, to draw a perspective of Aberdeen using a camera obscura. The possibility that Cresswell's initial sketch or study from the camera obscura was used as the basis for Mossman's painting may go some way to explain the odd perspective. Some artists, such as the 17th century Dutch master Johannes Vermeer, are renowned for their expert use of the camera obscura. But as one recent writer has observed, the image from the camera is merely a projection. To capture and transfer this to canvas requires skill, judgment, and time. We should remember this is not a mindless process and not a shortcut to success. It seems likely, therefore, that as familiar as Mossman may have been with the longhand calculation of perspective, he was much less familiar at working from a camera obscura projection. And yet, despite or in spite of the view's questionable composition, it remains a firm favourite with audiences, and perhaps it is the villainously bad perspective that makes for such an eye-catching work. The second observation of Mossman's work, being a painter's idyll, is taken from a 2003 written response to the painting by Doric poet Sheena Blackhall. Doric refers to the Scots language spoken in the northeast of Scotland. And while I don't want to attempt to murder the language this evening, I do want to point out and discuss briefly why Blackhall felt the need to describe Aberdeen as a painter's idyll. So here you can see the painting and a short extract from Sheena's work, also entitled View of Aberdeen, displayed beneath it. In this short excerpt, Blackhall makes the point that Mossman has actually painted a sanitised, cleaned up view of Aberdeen. His idyll overlooks the role that Aberdeen had had in the Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745, and even more notoriously overlooks the profit the town was making from trading in human flesh. You wouldn't know the reality from looking at this painting, as all's as smooth as glass. Though by no means exclusive to Aberdeen, the area during the 18th century was notorious for slave trading. The slaves in question, though, being young children kidnapped from the city streets, with the full knowledge and often complicity of town officials. The period in Aberdeen's history is typified by the case of one Peter Williamson, who was kidnapped aged 10 in 1743. After many experiences and adventures across the Atlantic, Peter returned to Aberdeen in 1758, wanting to expose the trade in Aberdeen and the powerful officials behind it. And yet, contrary to his hopes and expectations, he was the one that found himself on trial and was found guilty for scurrilous and infamous libel. It took a second court case to prove that Peter was telling the truth. Now, this trade was rife at the time Mossman painted this idyllic view of Aberdeen. And for me, it is Blackhall's poem that acts as a stark reminder that sometimes all is not as it seems. So often we're presented with a version, a perspective, or a view of the past. We can't instinctively know how to navigate it. We don't know what has been embellished or what has been omitted. And in the end, all we can be sure we have is one view among many. Now we fast forward into the 19th century and the era of the foundation of Aberdeen Art Gallery. Here you can see a self-portrait of Scottish artist Sir George Read. I don't know about you, but I love a self-portrait. The artist's choices about what to show, what not to show, the insight you may gain into their character, personality, their likes and dislikes, all together serve to keep me interested in the genre, and I think are the things that keep self-portraiture as a genre alive and relevant today. I've chosen this portrait, however, not so much as a standalone artwork to discuss, but in fact because of something that, if we just see it as a standalone artwork, we can never appreciate about it. because this portrait is in fact one of a series of 93 commissioned by Aberdeen granite merchant and patron of the arts, Alexander MacDonald, who together with Reed, seen here in the portrait, and fellow art collector John Forbes White, was a key driving force behind the establishment of Aberdeen Art Gallery in 1885. MacDonald on the left is seen here again in a portrait by Reed, and he began commissioning portraits in 1880. Artists were asked to paint a portrait of themselves or paint another artist. Unfortunately, MacDonald died in 1884, but his wife Hope continued to commission, and in the end, 93 uniformly sized portraits of contemporary artists were bequeathed to Aberdeen Art Gallery by her in 1901. I've always been fascinated by the series. For me, the 93 sum up MacDonald's tastes, but they're also a fascinating survey of the contemporary art scene of the late Victorian era. The series includes portraits of artists whose names we recognise today. For example, Dutch painters Joseph Israels and Sir Lawrence Alma Tadema, and founder of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Sir John Everett Millais. But the series also contains several less well-known figures today, such as the architect of New Scotland Yard, Richard Norman Shaw, and cartoonist for Punch magazine, Linley Sambourne. MacDonald's personal motivations for starting the project are unclear. It could have been important to him just to know what the artists whose work he loved looked like, or maybe he was commissioning the series to show off the scale of his artistic patronage or the geographical reach, and visitors to his home would be overawed and amazed by his accomplishment and efforts. There certainly is a long legacy of honouring through the display of portraits. Think back to the sculpted marble busts of the ancient world, the gods and emperors, generals, statesmen, writers and poets. From the Renaissance era, more and more of these portraits were painted, and it became fashionable for the walls of royal and aristocratic palaces to be decorated with likenesses, typically of generations of family members, all designed to strengthen dynastic claims and familial authority. The earliest instance of a collection of exclusively artists' portraits is attributed to the Florentine artist and historian Giorgio Vasari. In 1568, Vasari published an edition of his celebrated book, Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors and Architects, stretching back over the previous 3 centuries, illustrated with woodcut prints of their likenesses. And yet, MacDonald's approach was different. He wasn't looking back into the history of art. He was looking around himself into the world of contemporary art. So, if not motivated by a desire to honour the past or the long dead, what was MacDonald's project all about? Now, I personally like to think it was about the act of collecting itself, and it was collecting and acquiring things that motivated MacDonald. I don't think he commissioned the first portrait with any idea that it would culminate in a series of 93. But as with many collectors, once he had one, he quite simply wanted another. I've selected 2 images here to give you an idea of what this bug for collecting resulted in. On the left, you can see a selection of 40 of the artist's portraits and self-portraits displayed in Aberdeen Art Gallery. Unfortunately, we just didn't have the space to hang all 93 in one go. And on the right, you can see a photograph of the interior of MacDonald's dining room. It's quite literally crammed with paintings, many of which we can identify as those still in our collection today. These 2 images for me help to sum up the scale of MacDonald's collecting and his commitment to collecting. Unfortunately, MacDonald died before Aberdeen Art Gallery opened to the public in 1885, but his artworks in particular the portrait series, remain at the heart of our collection, and his focus on contemporary art continues to set the tone for collecting in Aberdeen today. Like so many visitors to Aberdeen Art Gallery, I love looking at this painting. It's quite simply glorious. It takes a long time to explore it. The detail is phenomenal, the colour startling. It draws you back time and time again, and each time you notice some new intriguing feature. The scene, of course, portrays Penelope's legendary marital fidelity, as recorded in Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey. For many years, Penelope's husband, Odysseus, had been absent at the siege of Troy, and pressed to make a second marriage, she stalls for time, telling the crowds of suitors that they must wait until she's finished weaving a shroud for her father-in-law. During the day, she works diligently under surveillance, but at night, convinced that Odysseus will return, she unpicks the day's work. In the ancient world, weaving was a major part of the labour women were expected to undertake, and as such became synonymous with womanhood. In Homer's poem, Penelope's weaving is tightly linked to her identity as a faithful wife, but it's also a nod to the perceived link between weaving and cunning, or inappropriate female cleverness. In Waterhouse's retelling of the story, Penelope is trapped, confined in her small, cramped home. Her loom, the paraphernalia of weaving, and the figures of Penelope and her two female servants leave little space for manoeuvre and movement. And one can only imagine the hot Mediterranean air. The sense of claustrophobia is palpable. The suitors, though visibly tiring and clearly losing their ardour, no doubt a reflection of the extreme length of their courtship, still act as jailers, their unending surveillance preventing escape and necessitating Penelope's ploy of unpicking the garment each night. Waterhouse's scene is so well conceived and manages to reveal to us several different stages and points of time and geography in the same scene. For example, what we clearly see here is daytime weaving, but by the inspired placing of a lantern above the loom, Waterhouse is also reminding us of the other side of the story, the nighttime undoing of the shroud. Similarly, we might suppose all the action key to the narrative is taking place in the confinements of the home. But the painted wall scene depicting warriors and fighting men placed just below the suitors reminds us that the reason for all of this action is Odysseus's absence, away fighting at the siege of Troy. There's a clear sense then that everything, every detail included, has meaning and purpose and is intended to be read and interpreted. It's therefore interesting to learn that Waterhouse made changes to the painting. In the painting, as we see it today, Penelope is sat on a stool, but early photography of the work shows she was originally sat on a chair with a decorative backrest. Why paint this out? Perhaps Waterhouse felt the back of the chair provided too much comfort, the chance for Penelope to briefly rest her back and remove the strain from her shoulders, not sitting well with his attempt to portray an arduous, unending task. Or perhaps Waterhouse removed the back to up the threat level. The photograph shows it shielding Penelope from the suitors, a barrier preventing the flower bearer in particular from leaning in just that little bit further and making physical contact. Without the backrest, Penelope is in a much more exposed position. Now, I have utmost respect for Penelope, her loyalty, diligence, and even her inappropriate female cleverness, and was initially surprised to learn of the furore surrounding the acquisition of the work by the Aberdeen Art Gallery Committee in 1912. Some Aberdonians criticised the work for its high price. but also criticised it for having a theme irrelevant to the public and a lack of local connection. I would suggest, however, that the problem with Waterhouse's chosen theme and subsequent criticism of it was because it was too relevant and had too much of a local connection. Consider, it's 1912 and Waterhouse has produced a scene wherein the female lead, despite displaying huge loyalty to her husband, is at the same time challenging male authority and the societal status quo. And she's using the setting of her home and her domestic skills to do so. In the same year in Aberdeen, several local suffragettes were arrested, fined and imprisoned for breaches of the peace and acts described as malicious mischief. Was there a worry that Penelope's story and Waterhouse's painting may become a rallying point for female emancipation in Aberdeen? Every era, of course, has its own context and set of circumstances that colour our reactions to and readings of works of art. For example, today, as I look at Penelope and the Suitors through 21st century eyes, I am minded to reflect on the status and treatment of women and girls in society today, and the considerable progress that still needs to be made. We're now going to get a bit more academic on the art analysis front. This painted triptych by Scottish artist Alison Watt epitomises to me Watt's focus in the 80s and early 90s on the human figure, before changing her style and abandoning it altogether, producing works of art notable for the complete absence of bodies. To me, it also reveals a great deal about Watt's interests and points of reference as an artist. For example, the classical architectural features and attention to drapery speak of a practitioner well grounded in the legacies of art history. When I look at cherries, forbidden fruit, and pear in a landscape, I find myself reminiscing over the style of artists of the Italian Quattrocento. For example, think Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus or Primavera, stylistically posed female figures, either nude or draped in fabric, set in imagined landscapes. Add to this the sense of naive perspective, and I almost feel I'm looking at a painting from 1491, not 1991. And then this makes me wonder, am I supposed to read Watt's paintings again through the eyes of the Italian Quattrocento, homing in on the symbolically placed objects and using these to decipher the meaning behind the painting? In the first painting on the left, we encounter the cherries of the title. In a 2017 Apollo magazine article entitled Sexing Up the Cherry, the authors document the cherry's long association in art and culture with the virgin, virginity, purity, and youth. Is this first painting, therefore, a depiction of those things? It certainly seems the case if we interpret the foliage arranged around the figure's lower abdomen as a chastity belt. The leaves resemble ivy, itself a traditional symbol of protection. So if the first painting is all about the protection of virginity and purity, what then do we make of the forbidden fruit in the central painting? Following the traditions in religious art, Watt portrays forbidden fruit in the form of an apple. The apple acquired this association for the similarity between the Latin words for apple and evil, malum. Its iconic role as the cause of Adam and Eve's fall from grace in the Garden of Eden is well known. In Watt's painting, however, the forbidden fruit has not been touched. No bite has been taken. It remains intact. The figure is posed in front of it and is looking beyond it. The crossed arms perhaps suggest rejection, or at least an attempt to reject the fruit's temptation. Moreover, the presence of daffodil flowers in the same painting is perhaps a reminder of the fate of those who eat the forbidden fruit. The daffodil or Narcissus flower is forever associated with the myth of Narcissus and the traits of excessive self-love, deceitful hopes and uncertainty, all of which should be avoided at all costs. But that, of course, becomes impossible if you take a bite from the forbidden fruit. In the third and final painting, we encounter the pear. In Christianity, a fruit associated with Christ's love for mankind. Interestingly, at the foot of the figure in this painting, we can see a large pile of rejected apples or forbidden fruit. Are we then to assume the temptation of the forbidden fruit has been overcome and the virginity and purity of the first painting have triumphed as a result of Christ's love for mankind? This Quattrocento reading of Watt's painting as a three-part storyboard charting the triumph of purity and virginity over the lure of the forbidden relies upon seeing the three paintings displayed together in triptych form. It is therefore, though, interesting to note that Watt is happy for the three to be split up and displayed separately. But how would that reveal the story I've just told you? In reality then, maybe this is a lesson for all art curators out there, not to overthink artworks or read excessive symbolic meaning into every piece of fruit they encounter. There are many compelling depictions of childhood and children in Aberdeen's collection, but the gaze of Jules Bastien Lepage's young girl going to school is one of the most arresting of them all. This rural schoolgirl wears a refashioned sack as a hood, which would have indicated her lowly status to the contemporary viewer. Although there seems no obvious social commitment in this painting of a young girl on her way to school on a cold morning, it was in fact painted in the wake of extensive reforms in education in France. The painting may have been conceived as an accompanying illustration for a text by French writer André Thuriet, with whom Lepage had planned a publication describing the cycle of country life. Although not published until after the artist's death, in a chapter on village life, Thuriet describes the daily trek to and from school. From 8 o'clock in the morning, winter and summer alike, one finds the children from the hamlets and outlying farms of the district on the roads leading to the market town. Clad in clogs and stout hobnailed boots, the boys and girls trudge noisily along, with their textbooks in folios under their arms. Following in the footsteps of Gustave Courbet, Lepage became the champion of the French realist school. By 1883, a critic proclaimed, "The whole of the world paints so much like Monsieur Bastien Lepage that Monsieur Bastien Lepage seems to paint like the whole world." Scottish collectors particularly admired his work, and he exerted formative influence on the young generation of painters known as the Glasgow Boys, including James Guthrie and John Lavery, whose work can also be seen in our collection. Going to school, or rather the inability to go to school, was one of the defining features of the COVID-19 lockdowns. For that reason, I was particularly delighted to find out that Lepage's painting, alongside others in Aberdeen's collection, had managed to bring so much fun and diversion to a group of friends separated by the same lockdown. Back in March 2020, 4 best friends decided to keep in touch by meeting every Friday for a video call. 3 of the friends live alone, and they knew that lockdown would have its challenges, so that they decided to set a creative weekly homework task to keep mentally and physically motivated. Originally, they saw the photo recreations of old masterpieces from the Getty Museum and decided to try some of their own, with some hilarious consequences. The majority of their photographic recreations were taken using mobile phones. They also had 2 strict rules: no photoshopping and only items already in their homes could be used. Nothing could be brought in. Over the course of the first lockdown, outtakes aside, the Friends recreated 27 works inspired by Aberdeen Art Gallery's collection, including Going to School. Here you can see Ruth Maxwell's glorious reimagining of going to school as going to the pub, another no-no during lockdown. As an art curator, nothing gives me more pleasure than seeing audiences and visitors engage with our collection, making meaningful connections and quite simply falling in love and having a favourite work of art. And however they choose to do that, I would celebrate. I hope this brief introduction to Aberdeen's collection will encourage you to learn more about the artworks we care for and display, and even take a plunge and visit the northeast of Scotland. You'll get a warm welcome and a truly memorable experience. Thank you so much for joining this talk. Enjoy the rest of your evening.